Will the children please come forward? Can everybody see me if I stand here? You can all see me if I stand here, right? Yeah. Okay. Okay, so I'm standing up today, and I'm going to invite you to stand up today, and I'm going to invite all of you to stand up today, if that's something that your body does happily. Because we aren't just going to have a conversation today, we are going to have a little exercise, and sometimes, okay, I'm speaking to a certain generation here, all right? There are all sorts of people of all ages here. You are all valid and wonderful, right? But right now, I am speaking to those of you who learned how to sing the preamble to the Constitution. Can you say the preamble to the Constitution? Can you do it without singing it? It is a lot harder. But I can sing the preamble to the Constitution thanks to Schoolhouse Rock. What is Schoolhouse Rock? That's a very good question. Schoolhouse Rock, okay, television, commercials, all sorts of things that you may or may not know what they actually are, but there used to be commercials on television, and sometimes instead of trying to sell you like Fruit Loops or Hot Wheels, they tried to teach you something, and Schoolhouse Rock was the best commercial to try and teach you something. And so there was multiplication rock, and there was grammar rock, and there was like civics stuff. I'm just a bill, yeah, I'm only a bill, and I'm sitting here on Capitol Hill. Yeah, so anyway. Conjunction, junction, that's not what's your function. Looking up words and phrases and clauses. Okay, Gen X is in the house. This makes me really happy.
Can I just add one thing?
Please.
And I'm not on mic, so I'm very sorry, but they weren't just commercials. Our U.S. government, the FCC, required a certain amount of educational content. So it was a public policy thing that brought this moment to you.
Yes.
Just putting that out there, democracy lovers.
Yes. Yes, indeed. Okay. But just like sometimes it is helpful to learn things through songs, today we're going to learn something with our bodies. Okay? And I think that I left it up here, and I really know it, but I am just afraid that I don't know it, so I want it. I dropped something. Thank you. That wasn't it, but this is it. Okay. Huh? I dropped my mask? I did. Oh, good heavens. Apparently we need bigger pockets on preacher's robes, don't we? Okay. So, when you want to get a big, big thing done, like public policy to make sure that television shows some educational programming, is the easiest way to do that with one person or with a whole lot of people?
17 million.
17 million, that is a, yes, yes, yes.
9,099,999.
Some big number of people. It makes it much easier to do big things if you have a big number of people, right?
9,999,999.
Okay, so
155,000.
you are all brilliant and smart, and I am so happy that you know lots of big numbers. Okay, but right now, we're talking social justice, so we are going to reach up for inspiration. Reach up for inspiration. We're going to reach down to the grassroots, because that is where all the best ideas happen. We are going to stir the winds of change. You can make wind noises if you want. And we are going to, you ready? I think you're going to like this part. We are going to stomp out injustice. So reach up for inspiration. Reach down to the grassroots. Stir the winds of change. And stomp out injustice. All right? That is the way to get stuff done.
Worship Associate this morning, and I want to reflect briefly on why Martin Luther King Day is important to me. My family have never been city people. As far back as I can trace my family tree, we've been part of the rural world, with only a few exceptions, not even in little towns. Mostly on farms near a small town. My parents, for example, each grew up about 5 miles away from Woodston, Kansas, which had a population of about 200. Farm families near small towns, and all in the north. The result of this is that there was little generational experience with people of color, and consequently, a virtual absence of negative attitudes, mostly just blissful ignorance. When I was 7, I moved to Barstow, California, and lived there till I went off to college. Barstow's in the middle of the Mojave Desert, about halfway between Las Vegas and Los Angeles. Aside from tourists passing through, it owes existence to 2 major factors. Santa Fe repair shops, established there by the railroad, and beginning in World War II, a huge Marine Corps supply center east of town, and a few miles north, the huge U.S. Army Training Center of Fort Irwin. As a result, the population has long been remarkably heterogeneous. The railroad brought Midwesterners and Southerners, as well as Native Americans and Hispanics from New Mexico. And the military rotated a cross-section of Americans through at frequent intervals. We weren't big enough to have ethnic neighborhoods, and the transient nature of the population meant we were all mixed together. My friends through high school included boys like William Samuel Campbell III, Euro-American, Dick Hernandez, Hispanic, Melvin Abeda, Native American, Joe Shaw, whose mother was from Mexico, and General Owens, African American. 5 ethnicities, although we didn't think in those terms. It was not long after I arrived at college that I came to realize that I had come from a very different world from most of my classmates. Most were from Los Angeles or its suburbs, and their families had moved there from other big cities, Chicago, Philadelphia, New York, big cities with significant minority populations and accompanying biases and prejudices. And they brought those attitudes with them: anti-Semitism, anti-Catholic attitudes, and, echoing Stephanie's sermon last week, superior attitudes towards Southerners. So I really only learned about these aspects of American society as a young adult. It's a lot for a 20-year-old to take in. But what a powerful and intense lesson it was, learning about these prejudices, and at the same time experiencing the reactions against them. We sat on a hill in Whittier and watched the fires burn in Watts. I had a classmate from Watts who provided us with firsthand accounts. Other classmates sat in at the local Woolworths. When we moved to Baltimore in 1963, apartment house dining rooms posted signs, "Members only," newly posted. Excuse me. Within a short distance of our apartment, there were well-defined Black, Greek, and Jewish neighborhoods. The caretakers of our apartment building would not sit at the counter of the lunch counter across the street, but rather stood at the end for takeout orders. I got a tour of burned-out Detroit from a local resident in 1969. That decade was a crash course in race relations, and standing at the lectern for that class was Martin Luther King, Jr. He was front and center on the news. Efforts to pass the Voting Rights and Civil Rights Acts dominated the political scene. King's example and his words made an enormous impact on me and my beliefs. So I'm happy to celebrate his holiday, which, unlike most national holidays, has not been completely taken over by Hallmark cards and sales at the appliance store. At least so far, it remains focused on the reasons it has been set aside. For me, it is a needed yearly reminder of how far we have come, but more importantly, how far we have to go.
When you think of a civil rights leader, who's the first person you think of? He was the face of the movement. He was a powerful orator, a wise and smart man. They are not always the same thing, who could write words that moved millions. But we are missing something when we only speak of Dr. King, when we honor the individual over the collective, when we fail to realize that one person alone can certainly inspire a movement, but that without active followers and other organizers, a movement cannot survive. And so today, we're going to look at a few of the other integral people who were part of the civil rights movement in the 1960s. And we're going to talk about how collectivism and collaboration and shared leadership are the way to get stuff done these days. Reach up for inspiration, reach down to the grassroots, stir the winds of change, and stomp out injustice. How many of you know the story of Rosa Parks? A tired Black woman who just wanted to sit down on the bus and started the Montgomery bus strike that integrated the buses in Montgomery, Alabama in 1956. It's a catchy story. It's not that simple. Rosa Parks, as well as Reverend Dr. King, both attended the Highlander Folk School in 1955, where they taught organizers. Race relations and nonviolent social justice topics were discussed. Ms. Parks was the secretary of the local NAACP and had been an investigator in a case where Reese Taylor, a Black woman, had been raped by 6 white men in Abbeville, Alabama in 1944. Mrs. Taylor did not get justice. But the coalition that was built around that case between labor unions and women's groups and African American organizations was integral to the success of the bus boycott 11 years later in 1955 and 56. The NAACP had been considering bringing a case against the segregated bus laws. There were some drivers who would actually, at this point in time, the driver was in the front of the bus, and a Black person had to enter the front of the bus, pay their fare, get off the bus, and get in the seat go in the door at the back of the bus. Some bus drivers just drove off after the fare had been paid. Montgomery wouldn't hire Black bus drivers, even though 75% of their ridership was Black. And on March 2nd, 1955, Claudette Colvin, a 15-year-old who was active in the NAACP Youth Council, was handcuffed and arrested after she refused to give up her seat to a white man. Black activists had thought to make her their test case, and then it was discovered she was pregnant, and they halted that because they needed a person who was above reproach. Now, on Montgomery buses, the first 10 seats were for white riders, and the last 10 seats were for Black riders. And the 16 seats in the middle were kind of up for grabs under a very complicated system. Because anyone could sit in those seats, but if a white person got on the bus and the first 10 seats were filled, and a Black person was sitting in the front row of those 16 rows, they had to get up and move further back in the bus. And if there wasn't a seat, it didn't matter. They had to stand, even though they'd gotten on the bus first. And in fact, if there was a seat in that row, and a white person came and sat in that row, a black person had to leave that row because white people shouldn't have to sit in the same row as black people. I really hope that's not the scene that gets stuck up on the YouTube video. We'll just hope for that. Okay. And so in December of 1955, Rosa Parks was sitting in the first row of the seats that were open to black people. And then a white person got on the bus, and the driver told her to get up and stand. And Mrs. Parks noticed at the time that that bus driver was the same one who had driven off after she'd paid her fare several years earlier. She had sworn not to get on any bus that he drove, but she hadn't noticed who it was in the beginning. And she stayed put and got arrested, and the NAACP had their case. It was a big ask, asking black people in Montgomery not to take the bus. A lot of black folks didn't own cars and needed to take the bus to get to school or to work, especially black domestic workers who had to go several miles to work in white homes in different neighborhoods. The boycott lasted a year. The community set up a private taxi service, and collections were taken for new shoes for folks who wore their shoes out walking so many miles. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., in his mid-20s, was the new minister in town. And he was nominated to be the face of the Montgomery Improvement Association and lead the boycott. And part of the reason for that was that he was new in town and had not been intimidated by the leadership of the city yet. But it was Joanne Robinson, the head of the Women's Political Council, that wrote and drew up the flyer calling for the boycott. After a whole year of walking, the Montgomery Improvement Association won their demands and the boycott was ended. It wasn't just Rosa Parks, and it wasn't just MLK. It was so many people organizing and walking and offering rides and negotiating with the bus company. Change takes people, not just leaders. There were so many other crucial organizers of the civil rights era. Bayard Rustin, who was a pacifist and organized many of the first freedom rides of the 1940s, challenging the laws that prevented black and white people from traveling together. Rustin was the behind-the-scenes organizer for the 1963 March on Washington for Jobs and Justice. But he stayed out of the spotlight because his homosexuality was used by opponents to discredit the cause. And Ella Baker, the highest-ranking woman in the national NAACP organization for years, started working for the group as a secretary in 1940. Her goal was to decentralize the leadership structure to aid its membership in having more local activist campaigns. She traveled all over the country, particularly in the South, and she built relationships with people. She would stay in folks' homes and build relationships, which she called on to achieve her goals of grassroots development. Everything's got to come from the grassroots. In 1957, she helped found the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, which aimed to be the political arm of the Black church, fighting for civil rights and local issues and racial justice, especially for Black Southerners. Later, she invited Black students who had been part of boycotts to participate with the Southern Christian Leadership Conference and encouraged them to form their own group, which became the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, the SNCC. She worked to get them trainings and skills and resources so they could do what they wanted to do and be independent of the older group. Together with Howard Zinn, she became one of the most trusted and valuable adult advisors to the SNCC, She encouraged them to keep listening to women, which was not a given in the 1960s. And she helped them form two wings, one focused on voter registration and one for direct action. According to Mumia Abu-Jamal, Baker advocated a more collectivist model of leadership over the prevailing messianic style of the period. She was largely arguing against the structure of the civil rights movement by the organization model of the Black church. The Black church then had largely female membership and almost exclusively male leadership. Baker questioned not only the gendered hierarchy of the civil rights movement, but also that of the Black church. And while Dr. King is the one that everyone remembers, it is Baker whose ideas are actually more popular now. Who could tell me who Alicia Garza or Patrisse Cullors are? Opal Tometi? Who can tell me what Black Lives Matter is? Those are the three women who started it. The Movement for Black Lives is now a coalition with more than 50 chapters that represent the issues of Black communities across the US. Issues like police violence, mass incarceration, food insecurity, and reparation for redlining, along with environmental racism are all issues that some groups focus on. And Black Lives Matter, along with the activism in Ferguson, were specifically begun as grassroots movements. In fact, I read that when Reverend Al Sharpton came to Ferguson and started directing the protesters, he was told by local organizers that his presence actually wasn't helpful. "We've got this, thank you." It has always been true that it takes far more than one person to make a movement. But it's more challenging to write history in that way. If you only have a couple of paragraphs in the history book about the civil rights movement, you're probably, and for good reason, going to talk about Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And this is no shade on Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. The man was astounding. But the thing is, for many of us, it is hard to put ourselves in that place. We may not be that eloquent, we are not that much of a leader, and so if we only see Dr. King, we may wonder where our place is in the movement for justice. It's like church, but on a broader scale. To be honest, I am probably the face in the world of the Unitarian Universalist congregation at Willamette Falls. Most folks here know who I am, and my role is important. I'll grant you that. But I am not the church. You may think that I am the best minister ever, but if people don't talk to you when you come in, or worse, are rude to you or unkind, you aren't going to stay. You may think that I am a fine minister, and if you've found your friends here, this is where you're going to be. When you ask someone why they come to Willamette Falls, most of the time they say the community. It's the religious education teachers who spend time with their kids. It's the sharing that happens during joys and sorrows. It's Sheila making coffee and putting out cookies. It's the music and the choir. It's Scott and Joanne and Michael and Sally and Louisa and Joan and Bev and Floyd and so many others working on the buildings and the grounds, making this 100-year-old edifice beautiful, or at least aiming for dry. It is Kate and Brian and the rest of the board trying to figure out how to make this congregation welcoming and inclusive. It is Kirsten and Chuck and Richard working on the day-to-day management of the congregation. It is Sojourner and Amy making sure that folks can watch over Zoom and you can hear what's going on. It is all of our staff keeping this place running. And it's Ellen and Jim and Eni and Jesse and Eric and Julia and Kate and Diana and Kate. We have so many Kates and so many others who represent our values in the world, feeding hungry people. It's Anna and Chelsea on school boards, sharing our values of inclusion and opposing censorship. Social justice movements are never about one person, no matter who that person might be. Churches are not about one person, no matter who that person might be. All of us, every single one of us, has a role to play in moving the arc of the world towards justice and in making our spiritual home a welcoming place. May it be so. Blessed be, and amen.